Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Little Big Adventure 2, an action-adventure title developed by Adeline Software International and published by Electronic Arts for the MS-DOS and Windows computer platforms back in 1997. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Foss, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC, Lewis W., Martin Steiner, Melody Octavia, James Nunn, Yuzu Soda, Vince Gameplays, and Marek. Thanks to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into Little Big Adventure 2, I thought it'd be a good idea to let you know why I chose Little Big Adventure 2 for today's episode. And the fact is, the reason I picked LBA 2 for today is because of Little Big Adventure 1. A couple years ago, at this point, I think it was around 2-ish years ago or so, we did an episode on Little Big Adventure 1. It was actually a sponsored episode by Rich Senewald. And before then, I had never played the game before. I had heard of it, and I knew that there was, for whatever reason, some kind of really strong fan following of the game, especially for people who played the game back when they were younger. They would always talk about Little Big Adventure as being this magical experience and something that they had such fond nostalgia for. I myself had no nostalgia for Little Big Adventure 1, but of course I played the game myself to judge what I personally felt about the game, what my own personal opinions were. And after playing that game, I came away fairly impressed. I could totally see where that magical feeling came from. The music, the overall whimsy of the experience. There were some things that I thought the game didn't quite get right, like the controls, the overall way that you aim and try to do combat in the game, which from my perspective was pretty darn frustrating to try to get right. Trying to aim your little magic ball the right way and have physics work for you instead of against you, that was tricky. There were also some other design decisions that kind of baffled me. Like, why? When you were running around the game, would you hit a wall and then take damage? I get the realism aspect, but this is not a realistic game. You're playing this alien creature that's on a totally different planet. You don't need to run into walls and take damage. That is just a design decision that really bogged the game down. At the end of the day, though, I still actually really enjoyed the experience. I thought it was a great game. Not a perfect game, not the best game, but a pretty darn good game. And it did achieve a golden oldie status when we reviewed it back a couple years ago. Since that time, Little Big Adventure has gotten a little bit of a bad rap, especially on our Discord server, where it has become the butt of jokes, especially by one of our longest members, ISO. ISO is not a fan of Little Big Adventure. He does not like it. He has, I'm assuming, he has nightmares about the Temple of Boo. He just does not like Little Big Adventure. I don't really agree with ISO fully on that. I mean, certainly Little Big Adventure has some flaws, but I could kind of see past the flaws to the magic hidden within. I'm not sure ISO really felt like that. So, as I was starting to think about next episodes to do and episodes I wanted to revisit, I definitely have kept Little Big Adventure 2 kind of in my back pocket. It's something I always wanted to experience, or at least I always wanted to experience after experiencing Little Big Adventure 1, because I was curious how the sequel would respond to some of the critiques I had, because I knew that the development team behind the game did take some feedback from the time that it was originally released into account when they made Little Big Adventure 2. And I was curious if the kind of feedback that they responded to would have been similar to the feedback that I provided during my episode on the podcast. I was also curious, and this is something I was kicking around a little bit, I was considering making ISO play Little Big Adventure 2 for the podcast, giving him a little bit of a challenge to say, hey, ISO, go play the game and let me know what you think. Now, this was before I actually played the game. I just thought it'd be something kind of fun, especially considering how much he disliked Little Big Adventure 1. I was curious whether he would like Little Big Adventure 2. I ultimately did not issue that challenge to ISO, at least not in time for this episode, but I am making it right now. ISO, this is a challenge, a personal challenge to you. Go out, go play Little Big Adventure 2, and then let us all know what you think. Putting that personal challenge aside, though, I personally was curious about Little Big Adventure 2, and I will freely admit that after playing Little Big Adventure, even though it is very much in our rearview mirror, now we have moved past Little Big Adventure now by a couple years, there was still something there. There was something there that was kind of whispering to me and saying, hey, don't you want a little bit more of this? And I would always say, get out of my head. But then I would think about it and I'd say, well, maybe I do. Maybe I do want more Little Big Adventure. So I considered I could have played the Little Big Adventure remaster, which I actually am planning to do at some point. But then I thought to myself, well, why just do the remaster? Why not go to the sequel? So that is exactly what we're going to do today as we discuss Little Big Adventure 2. And I needed to know, as I sat down to play this game, I needed to know, would Little Big Adventure 2 be as charming, but still flawed as Little Big Adventure 1? And as a bonus, kind of side benefit, would ISO hate Little Big Adventure 2 as much as he hated LBA 1? Or will this be an example of a sequel that eclipses its predecessor and an experience that becomes a classic in its own right? That is the question we're going to attempt to answer as we start talking about Little Big Adventure 2. Little Big Adventure 2 is an action-adventure title developed by Adeline Software International and published by Electronic Arts for the MS-DOS and Windows computer platforms back in 1997. Before we can talk about Little Big Adventure 2, we need to talk about the game's creator, Frédéric Raynal, a French game developer who over the years would be responsible for some pretty revolutionary titles in the computer and video game industry. The thing is, though, Raynal isn't exactly a household name, despite numerous accolades and industry firsts that in some ways rival the accomplishments of more well-known and celebrated game designers. So let's address that disparity by shining a spotlight on Frédéric Raynal. First, though, I should mention that the majority of our historical discussion is going to mirror the discussion we had when talking about Little Big Adventure back around 2 years ago, simply because without Little Big Adventure, there would be no Little Big Adventure 2. If you happen to listen to both of these episodes back to back, a good chunk of the history will be identical. But in order to keep each of our episodes as standalone experiences and be able to tackle sequels to games we may have discussed previously, a little bit of repetition is inevitable. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's start talking about Frédéric Raynal. From a very young age, Renal had always been interested in technology, and he began creating his first games while he was still in high school, focusing on some simple games designed for the Sinclair ZX81 home computer. For those who may be unaware, the Sinclair ZX81 was a home computer primarily distributed in the UK, and was the immediate predecessor to the ZX Spectrum, which is perhaps a bit more well known. At the time Renal began developing his earliest games, he didn't have access to a ZX Spectrum because, well, it hadn't been released yet. So he settled on the ZX81, complete with a 256 by 192 pixel monochrome resolution monitor, a 3.25 MHz 8-bit CPU, and up to 32 kilobytes of RAM. While those specs might seem downright paltry in comparison to what we have today, for the time, they were pretty much on par with other computer platforms. And Renal put those specs to good use, creating his first commercial game, Robix 500, while he was working at his father's computer shop. That game sold a grand total of 80 copies over its lifetime, which, as you might imagine, did not really make it onto any sales charts. But it did prove to Renal that he could potentially make money creating games. More successful, though, was a somewhat tangential effort that Renal began working on a couple years later, which was the creation of a variety of emulators to access the Minitel online service. Now, if you're like me, you might be asking yourself, what the heck is a Minitel online service? Well, it turns out Minitel is actually an interesting slice of history itself, as prior to the World Wide Web, which we all know and love, Minitel was the most successful online service in the world. Minitel was primarily a French online service launched in 1980, and right from its inception, it offered capabilities that wouldn't become commonplace on the modern internet for the next 15 years. Things like email, online purchases, chat, travel tickets, all of those and more were available on the Minitel service, and Renal developed a number of Minitel emulators for use on a variety of models within the Amstrad family of computer systems, another European computer platform designed at the time to compete with the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64 microcomputers. While Renal's Minitel emulators would garner him some industry attention, he still in his heart wanted to develop games, which is what prompted him to seek out formal employment in the video game industry. In the late 80s, he found the perfect match as he would join the French development company Infogrames. Infogrames was founded in 1983 by Bruno Bonnel and Christophe Sepet, and was intended from the start to be a premier video game developer, focused, at least initially, on the French computer game market. Similar to Renal's early efforts, Infogrames developed games for a variety of computer platforms, with perhaps the most well-known title from their early years, at least to me, being a game called Hostages, which ended up being ported to a number of different systems over the years. The version of that title that I played when I was a kid was called Rescue the Embassy Mission, which was an NES game focused on infiltrating a terrorist-held building in the hopes of rescuing the civilians that had been taken hostage. I remember loving that game, by the way, and the variety of gameplay included, which ran the gamut from side-scrolling stealth to sniping enemies appearing in front of windows to rappelling down the side of a building to infiltrating that building from an over-the-shoulder perspective. All of it was simply awesome. Admittedly, I do not have the deepest knowledge of some of the computer platforms Infogrames developed for, like the Amiga, so it's entirely possible there are other well-known titles that I'm simply less informed about. But suffice it to say, any glance at Infogrames' game catalog shows a company that was pretty prolific in the game development scene, and the sheer variety of experiences they created demonstrates how talented their developers were, as unlike many companies who may have focused on one or two primary game types, Infogrames titles spanned numerous genres and playstyles. Which is to say, when Frederic Renal joined the company, he didn't know what the heck his first job was going to be. Maybe he would work on a side-scrolling platformer, or maybe he'd be tasked with bringing a new role-playing game to life. Well, it turns out that he would instead be asked to port three-dimensional platforming title Alpha Waves to the MS-DOS computer platform. At this point, some of you might be saying, wait a second, three-dimensional platforming title? What year are we in again? To which I would reply, 1990. Then I could imagine some of you saying, okay, 1990. So you don't mean real 3D platforming. You're talking about some sort of pseudo 3D similar to Doom and Wolfenstein, right? To which I would reply, well, no. I mean actual real 3D, as in a game world with three-dimensional objects, not simply projections of two-dimensional items into 3D perspectives. That might be a bit shocking to some of you, so I might hear you say, really? And I'd come right back with, yes, really. While our hypothetical conversation might go on for another few minutes after that, I'll cut to the chase by saying that yes, Alpha Waves was indeed a true 3D platforming title, and was in fact developed in 1990. Alpha Waves creator, Christophe de Dinachamps, was an incredibly smart computer scientist, and in this context, when I say computer scientist, I mean legit scientist-level skills. Many game developers go to school for computer science in order to acquire a job as a software developer, but most of the time, the computer science theory that those individuals learn is just the stepping stone to learning a bunch of programming languages. Christophe de Dinachamps, by contrast, was more focused on the actual theoretical possibilities of computers, and over his career, he would develop algorithms for computational analysis, operating systems for enterprise-class data center servers, programming languages, and three-dimensional animation, while also authoring 3 books covering both fiction and nonfiction. His work in the field of computer science, and specifically the operating system efforts I just mentioned, resulted in 10 US patents. To put it mildly, Christophe de Dinachamps is a bright guy. So, when he set his sights on putting some of that theoretical knowledge to the test in 1990, he knew he wanted to do something unique to test the boundaries of what a computer game engine would be capable of doing. Which is why he created Alpha Waves, considered by the Guinness Book of World Records to be the first three-dimensional platforming title ever made. In Alpha Waves, you control one of several different aircraft, which are technically just geometric shapes in the game, and your goal is to bounce on a series of trampoline-like objects scattered about three-dimensional spaces in the game, with each bounce allowing you to progress higher and higher into the sky. As you bounce around these platforms, you make your way to various holes in the walls of the room that you're in, and assuming you can time your jump and reach the appropriate height successfully, you'd make your way through those holes into other rooms, repeating the same process over again, with each platforming room effectively being a self-contained puzzle. While the concept is pretty simple by today's standards, the execution for the time was mind-blowing. No one had ever created three-dimensional spaces with such smooth motion in a video game before. Sure, there were other 3D titles, but nothing with the same speed and smoothness of gameplay, or the sheer number of objects displayed on the screen at one time. Now admittedly, the visuals were super simple, flat-shaded three-dimensional shapes, but the gameplay was unlike anything anyone had experienced before. As Reynal worked on porting the title to DOS, he became enamored with the concept of 3D in computer gaming, and he began to consider that three-dimensional worlds were going to quickly become the next big thing in the video game industry. He knew that he wanted to continue exploring 3D as a technology for his next game, but there was just one issue. He didn't know what the next game was going to be. While he awaited his next assignment, Reynal continued to learn about three-dimensional animation and graphics, and after porting Alpha Waves to DOS in 1990, he began working on a tool designed to create and animate three-dimensional characters. While he was working on this new tool, he was approached by Infogrames CEO Bruno Bonnell, and was asked to develop a game whose main gameplay mechanic was the concept of navigating completely dark scenes using a match to highlight snapshots of an individual area. As soon as he heard the idea, Reynal began brainstorming, and he fairly quickly honed in on the potential that the concept had as a core mechanic in a horror title. Believing this would be a perfect match, Reynal went to the CEO and convinced Bonnell that his next game should be a horror experience. Bonnell didn't need to deliberate long before he granted approval for the project, and with that, Reynal set off to begin creating the game that would eventually become known as Alone in the Dark. Reynal had fairly high aspirations for his game, but was also keenly aware of how difficult it would be for computers of the time to render realistic graphics. Recall that while Renal had experience in 3D as a result of his work on Alpha Waves, those 3D graphics were simple, flat-shaded shapes. They were not, by any standard, realistic. Because of that experience, as well as the available technology of the time, Renal came to the conclusion that computers of the time were incapable of rendering graphics that would create fear and dread among players. So he decided to tell most of the story elements via text. Despite the technological limitations, though, his plan was still to create a fully realized three-dimensional world, with real photographs to be used as the foundation for the three-dimensional rooms placed throughout what would end up becoming the game's haunted mansion. But this also proved to be challenging, and eventually it was determined that creating fully realized 3D spaces would be too difficult to include with the game. So, each background in the game was actually made of two-dimensional images, while characters and items were true three-dimensional models made up of polygons. Because 3D models were being combined with 2D backdrops, each and every scene in the game had to be presented very deliberately so as to maintain the illusion of the player traversing a true three-dimensional space. So, the game's development team settled on the concept of utilizing fixed camera angles and various scene and camera angle transitions as the player explored the game's environments. Interestingly, while the reason behind the fixed camera angles was purely technical, that restriction actually ended up improving the game's tension and horror elements, as the design team was able to frame scenes using cinematic techniques, striving to create the most dramatic and scary camera shots that would ultimately serve to instill a sense of dread in the player. While the discussions of the rest of the game's mechanics are beyond the scope of this particular episode, and were also covered a bit during our discussion on Resident Evil, as well as, by the way, our full episode on Alone in the Dark, the fact is that Renal had a hit on his hands, and Alone in the Dark would end up being critically acclaimed and generally enjoyed amongst the broader gaming community, while being the first title to really shine a spotlight on Infogrames as a company. Sure, prior to Alone in the Dark, Infogrames was successful and prolific in the development of various gaming titles, and various games did have their niche fan bases. After Alone in the Dark, though, the broader gaming public knew who the company was. And, by the way, in yet another first, Alone in the Dark would be recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records as being the first 3D survival horror title. That marks the second world's first title Infogrames, and by extension Renal, were involved with. Despite the success of Alone in the Dark, not everything was smooth sailing during its development. As I just mentioned, Renal had convinced Infogrames CEO Bruno Banel to allow him to develop a 3D horror title, and Banel did approve that venture without much issue. During development, though, Infogrames leadership was often hesitant to explore new ideas, and Renal became frustrated with leadership's hesitation to take risks with new, albeit unproven, mechanics. Renal was focused on experimentation and creation, while Infogrames was concerned that trying too much too soon might hurt sales. For Alone in the Dark, Infogrames would be proven wrong, but as work began on its sequel, Renal once again felt like he wasn't free to try new ideas or explore different game mechanics. Infogrames wanted a direct sequel with some light gameplay changes, like more of a focus on action, while Renal wanted to continue to explore more horror elements while also including more action than its predecessor. Eventually, Renal became fed up with Infogrames' reluctance to listen to his ideas, so he ended up leaving the company in 1993, along with several other Infogrames developers, designers, and artists, to form a new company, Adeline Software. Something I found interesting, but is somewhat tangential to our discussion, is that Adeline Software was founded as a subsidiary to Delphine Software, another French game development studio who was responsible for both Out of This World, or Another World, depending on where in the world you are, and Flashback, two titles that we have discussed on prior episodes of the podcast. I always find it interesting how all of these different companies and histories seem to intersect in some way. Anyway, with the founding of Adeline Software, Renal was faced with a decision. For the first time in his professional career, he had carte blanche to create the game he wanted to create, free from being assigned a specific project or needing to rein in his ideas to meet some corporate expectations. So, he sat down to begin creating a new concept for a game, one that would allow him to embrace all of his ideas, continue to expand the use of 3D in games, and hopefully appeal to gamers around the world. He came up with a concept involving a man imprisoned for having prophetic dreams, a world ruled over by a mad scientist, and a small but powerful resistance who sought to find a legendary being known as the Heir, with the hopes of overthrowing the oppressive regime and returning every island across the land to a peaceful, non-militaristic state. That game concept is what would ultimately form the foundation for Little Big Adventure. While creating Little Big Adventure, Reynal and the team decided on a few main features that the game had to have. For one, it had to be visually impressive. Reynal wanted to continue advancing the state-of-the-art in 3D technology, and he wanted Little Big Adventure to be more technologically advanced than other 3D titles of the time. Those graphics were intended to bring a game full of whimsy and adventure to life, and Reynal conceptualized a world inhabited by multiple people of different cultures and races, all living on a series of islands that dotted the landscape of the game world's planet. Each of those islands and the areas on those islands were designed to be distinct. Some would feature intense enemy placements, effectively being fortified headquarters, while others would be more peaceful and exploration-focused. And for the player, Reynal wanted to provide complete freedom for how an individual may approach a given situation. Do you approach a heavily guarded fortress from the front, guns blazing? Or do you sneak around and behind guards, silently infiltrating the enemy lair to locate your target? Reynal wanted each approach to be viable, and he felt that in doing so, players would feel immersed and want to continue exploring Little Big Adventure's unique world. With those goals in mind, let's turn our attention to the game's graphics, which were created using three-dimensional models inhabiting an isometric perspective game world. That might not sound all that impressive, and it's true that other games around this time were playing around with isometric perspectives and 3D characters. But those other games often had to compromise in order to achieve any degree of playable performance, oftentimes resorting to displaying graphics at a resolution of 320 by 240 pixels, which was pretty standard for computer technology of the time. Reynal and the team, though, wanted to exceed those expectations, so they ended up designing their title to display graphics in a 640 by 480 pixel resolution, which is effectively 4 times the number of pixels for a computer to process. Now, you might assume that such a bump in resolution would impact playability, but the team spent extra time developing an approach that would maintain performance, and in fact, in some cases, even exceeded the performance of less graphically intense titles, while still running on the same base hardware platforms. Back when we originally spoke about Little Big Adventure 2 years ago, I couldn't find anything on how the team was able to pull off this frankly amazing feat of engineering, but since then, a new interview was published with one of the game's designers, Didier Chanfray, that helps shed some light on this aspect of the game's development. It turns out that the team was forced to figure out a way to make the game run on less powerful machines, because the machines they were using to make the game were, in fact, not all that powerful. So, the developers spent time building their own proprietary tools, blending custom toolsets for animation, modeling, and physics, with pre-existing industry-wide standards like 3D Studio Max and Photoshop, to construct a development tool pipeline that was highly optimized in comparison to simply picking a pre-made engine off the shelf and using it. Now, to be fair, there weren't nearly as many industry-wide game engines back in the mid to late 90s as there are today, with development environments like Unity and Unreal not yet in existence. But still, the care with which the team developed their own resources to make the game actually function in the first place showed just how much care and attention was being placed into making Little Big Adventure a quality experience. The team would even code certain parts of the game using assembly language, which is effectively as close to controlling the specific hardware within a machine as a human can usually get. Most games by the mid-90s were using natural language integrated development environments, like Visual Studio, C, and C++. Assembly language was typically only used in this era of gaming when a developer needed to wrest every last ounce of performance from a given machine, which, in the case of Little Big Adventure, is exactly what needed to be done. The fact that they got all of this working with the level of graphics that the game eventually employed is a testament to the talent and dedication of the team making the game. Even impressive graphics, however, aren't enough to make a quality game. What you really need are interesting mechanics And here, Reynal and the team implemented an approach that was somewhat of an evolution to what they had originally created for Alone in the Dark, and that is the concept of moods or behaviors being changeable depending on your desired approach to a given situation. Perhaps you want to walk around like a normal citizen, talking with others and examining your environment. Well, you can do that. Or maybe you need to get somewhere fast, leaping over obstacles to get away from enemies in pursuit. Well, that'd work too. And sometimes, you may need to take a stand, with the only option being to fight your adversary. Or perhaps a better approach would be to avoid that confrontation altogether, choosing instead to remain in the shadows. All of those possibilities were accounted for in the game's design. And while I will talk more about what I think of this gameplay system within the context of LBA 2, there is no denying that the concept was innovative and added a layer of depth not often seen in other action-adventure titles. Turning our attention to music, great effort was taken by the game's composer, Philippe Vichet, to create a soundtrack that would create the right atmosphere for the game's world. And here, the team was lucky in that they had decided early on to embrace the new for the time CD-ROM format that was quickly gaining market share. The thought was, using CD-ROM technology would allow the team to expand on nearly every aspect of the title, and from a musical perspective, that meant that Vichet was able to compose music using real instruments, recorded as separate tracks and played from the CD as Red Book audio, which is an audio format that simply means the audio is stored on the CD as specific tracks and streamed while it plays, as opposed to being stored as separate files accessible in a computer, like an MP3 might be today. Using Red Book audio meant that the quality of the soundtrack could be improved beyond other synthesis-based game soundtracks, but it also came with an unforeseen limitation. Beyond the music, the team also wanted to utilize full voice acting for each character in the game, with each voiced character line stored as separate files on the CD. In a game made today, or more accurately within the last 20 years, that would be no issue, because those files could simply be installed onto your computer to be played back at the appropriate time. But hard drives back then weren't all that big, and in fact, a state-of-the-art business-oriented hard drive from 1994 would likely be a max of around 500 megabytes in size. A CD-ROM disk holds 650 megabytes worth of data, so it's fairly obvious that CD-based titles couldn't simply be installed on machines in full. They needed to stream their data when it was needed. The issue here is that Red Book Audio can't stream at the same time as a CD drive would be streaming data files, at least not without causing the audio to stop playing. So, the team had to come up with a workaround, eventually settling on doing a temporary installation of speech files every time you navigated to a new island in the game. That way, they could minimize the impact on playing the game's soundtrack, while also ensuring that hard drives weren't overrun with files that would only be used in certain parts of the game. Not to skip ahead, but a fairly common complaint of this approach were the somewhat lengthy load times that would occur whenever those speech files were being transferred to a user's hard drive, which was likely exacerbated by the fact that CD-ROM drives around this time weren't exactly speedy. The fastest CD-ROM drive available was a quad-speed drive, otherwise known as 4X, and was capable of transferring data at a rate of 600 kilobytes per second. To get those blistering fast transfer speeds, though, you would have had to spend around $1,000, or the equivalent of almost $2,100 today. As you might imagine, those drives were not used by the majority of the population. More commonly found in consumer computers around this time were single and double speed drives, capable of 150 kilobytes and 300 kilobyte per second transfer rates respectively. With those speeds, even with small speech files, the time required to transfer those files could be a bit excessive. Anyway, eventually, the key elements of sound, gameplay, and game mechanics came together into a cohesive package, and Little Big Adventure would release to the market in late 1994, with several less than stellar ports to Japanese computer platforms, as well as the Sony PlayStation following. Upon its release, critics would applaud the game's creativity, high-quality graphics, and engaging gameplay, with some even going so far as to name it one of the best games of all time. Beyond the critical response, Little Big Adventure would capture the hearts and minds of gamers, and would prove to be a commercial success, with over 500,000 copies sold within a couple years of its release. Interestingly though, the majority of those sales would come in Europe, with only 30,000 copies sold in the United States, an absolutely paltry number in comparison to the game's popularity in other geographic areas. So you might be wondering, why such poor performance in the US? Well, it actually comes down to how the game was marketed, as Electronic Arts, or EA, the game's publisher, didn't have faith that the game as designed would have strong sales. EA would reach out to Adeline Software repeatedly prior to release, asking them to make the main character, Twinsen, a tougher character, and constantly requesting the game to be made more action-centric. In EA's words, they wanted Twinsen to kick ass, believing that the current iteration of the game, with combat being somewhat optional in many situations, just wasn't going to sell in the United States. For their part, Adeline Software refused to change their game, which I think was the right call. Unfortunately, EA still wanted to focus on the combat that was included in the game, so while the rest of the world received Little Big Adventure, the United States received Relentless Twinsen's Adventure, an attempt to make consumers believe this was more of an action-oriented experience. Even in various advertising materials, EA marketed the title as an action game, choosing to focus on combat as opposed to the more charming, whimsical elements of the game and its world. Now, we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but combat is not the strongest part of the Little Big Adventure formula, and I can only imagine how frustrating it must have been to Renal and the rest of the Adeline Software team for EA to completely misrepresent the game that they had poured their hearts and souls into. Regardless, the fact is that Little Big Adventure is a title that would touch the lives of numerous gamers around the world, and I would venture a guess that if you played the title back when it was first released, you'd likely have many fond memories of the experience. Those fond experiences and player support would eventually lead Renal and the team to release a sequel in 1997, which was, of course, Little Big Adventure 2. As the team began conceptualizing this new game, they knew that they wanted to take everything that made Little Big Adventure great and expand upon it. That meant improving the graphics yet again by developing even more fully realized 3D rendering technology, a shift towards true 3D that the first game mimicked but never really achieved. Rather than using 3D models and clever perspective correction to create the illusion of a fully 3D world, Little Big Adventure 2 would in fact be a true 3D landscape, complete with all the bells and whistles that gamers of the time expected from the still developing 3D era of gaming. Interestingly, while the team would be able to build a fully realized 3D world, they would not be able to take advantage of the dawn of hardware-based 3D acceleration to improve performance and quality of those 3D environments. This was mainly due to the fact that 3D acceleration technology was still relatively new as the game was being developed, and attempting to integrate such a forward-leaning technology into their development process would have far exceeded the budget available for the title. Instead, the team decided to optimize what they could with their software, and evolve the engine created for the original game to support Little Big Adventure 2's more expansive scope and technical capabilities. Nearly everything about Little Big Adventure 2 was designed to be bigger and better than its predecessor, from the graphics, to the music, to the number of locations and environments that players would explore, to the depth of gameplay available for gamers to enjoy. And even beyond the more obvious changes the team was putting into place, a number of other modifications would be implemented intended to address much of the feedback that players provided following Little Big Adventure's original release. This included making it so that wall collisions would no longer occur, which, let me tell you, was a big deal for anyone who played the original title, along with a bunch of other gameplay tweaks that we'll talk through in a few minutes. The bottom line is, Little Big Adventure 2 was a true labor of love for all involved. The team believed in Little Big Adventure, and while the first title hadn't sold all that well outside of Europe, there were still high hopes that its sequel could achieve even greater success. Eventually, Little Big Adventure 2 would release on the market in 1997, and it would, similar to the first game, sell really well in France and the rest of Europe, while dramatically underperforming in the United States. There was general recognition that for some reason, a disconnect existed between the two regions, and GameSpot magazine even referenced this observation in a review for the title, stating, and I quote, that in France, Twinsen is big. In the States, he's an obscure oddity. After the 1997 sequel was released, Adeline Software would be sold to Sega and rechristened under the name No Cliché. As no cliche, the team would develop and release a couple of additional games, none of which received any significant attention, and unfortunately, despite how talented the team was, and despite their European successes, in the early 2000s, the company was effectively disbanded. Delphine Software, the owner of the Adeline Software brand, would attempt to revitalize it in 2002, though this was effectively in name only, as no members of the original team remained in the company. That revitalization would be short-lived, as Delphine Software itself would be liquidated in 2004, which effectively marked the end of Adeline Software in the computer industry. But the story doesn't end there. Frederic Reynal and other members of the Little Big Adventure team had continued to believe in the game series, and for the last 20-plus years, they've tried to keep it alive through re-releases, plans for a remaster, mobile ports, and various other efforts to potentially resurrect Twinsen. Finally, to the delight of many fans, in 2021, a new company was formed with members of the original Little Big Adventure team, 2.21, and shortly after its formation, they announced that they were working on a brand new entry in the Little Big Adventure universe. At the same time, they also announced full-scale remakes of the first two titles, with modernized controls and graphics, and some revisions to the overall design to make the game feel more like a current title. As you might imagine, expectations and hopes were high, and following the announcement, several updates were posted by the team about overall progress on their efforts. Things seemed to be going well until July of 2023, when Little Big Adventure 3 would be unexpectedly cancelled, with the team citing the inability to find a publishing partner to bring the game to market. While the first Little Big Adventure remake was in fact completed and released in late 2024, the remake for its sequel remains in development, and while there's always hope that Little Big Adventure 3 will eventually see the light of day, any definitive plans for a future third entry in the series have had to be put on hold for now. While Little Big Adventure as a franchise might not have the worldwide recognition of many of the more popular games in the industry, that in no way diminishes what it is, which is a well-crafted, charming adventure that is beloved by nearly anyone who has played it. It's also a shame that Frederic Reynal, as a game designer, doesn't receive as much attention as he ultimately deserves. He may not have the same name recognition of a Shigeru Miyamoto, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't be as respected. In fact, in 2006, Reynal, along with Miyamoto and Michel Ancel, the creator of Rayman, were all knighted in France, becoming the first video game designers to ever receive French knighthood as Knights of Art and Literature. To say Reynal had a major impact on the video game industry would be an understatement, and without his efforts, Little Big Adventure would have never existed. There are tons of other titles that are more well remembered and lauded by players around the world, but for some reason, it just feels different when people talk about Little Big Adventure and its sequel. Anyone I've spoken to, any podcast I've listened to, nearly everything I've read from fans of the game, they all express a true and deep appreciation for the franchise. Sure, other games may be loved the same way as you might love an athlete for scoring the winning goal in a World Cup match, but with the Little Big Adventure series, people talk about it almost like it's a family member. An indelible and cherished mark on their childhood, a whimsical and charming tale of adventure, and an experience and memory that will likely remain with them forever. My question, as I sat down to play Little Big Adventure 2 for this episode of the podcast, was whether LBA 2 really did have the same degree of charm as the first title, or if it was a sequel that, while well-intentioned, wasn't quite as good as the original. We are going to attempt to answer that question now as we continue to dive deeper into Little Big Adventure 2. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Little Big Adventure 2 today versus when it was released almost 30 years ago. Little Big Adventure 2 is, like its predecessor, an action platforming puzzle adventure stealth title, which might sound like an absolutely ludicrous combination of genres to attempt to balance in a single game. And, like we talked about during our episode on the very first Little Big Adventure, trying to balance so many related yet divergent gameplay mechanics can at times result in a bit of a miss. When we talked about Little Big Adventure, I was adamant about the fact that the game was flawed, but still a really worthwhile experience if you take the time to learn all of its different eccentricities and nuances. Despite some of Little Big Adventure's design decisions resulting in a game that is admittedly rough around the edges, there was also something charming and magical about the overall experience, and I could totally see why Little Big Adventure has remained highly regarded by a large portion of the gaming community who had an opportunity to play the game back when it first came out. Little Big Adventure 2, being a direct sequel to that first game in the series, has oftentimes been lumped into the discussion, but there hasn't always been a lot of discourse around how Little Big Adventure 2 evolved the LBA formula to become something different than its predecessor. And the simple reason why that is that LBA 2 is incredibly similar to the first LBA in nearly every capacity. The overall framework for the game, the general controls, the look and feel, the mechanics at play. So much of what you'll experience with LBA 2 will appear to be nearly identical to LBA, and you might be wondering if LBA 2 is simply an experience that's quote-unquote more of the same, a simple reskin and expansion of the original title to take advantage of the goodwill the LBA team had garnered with fans of the original title, albeit with the same inherent flaws that we previously discussed during our LBA dedicated episode from a couple years ago. Well, I will admit, that was the exact question I had when I decided to play LBA 2 for an episode of the podcast, and after spending just 30 minutes with the game, I formed some immediate first impressions, all of which can be summed up in a single phrase: bigger and better. Obviously, first impressions can be deceiving, and I was under no illusions that a 30-minute slice of game could possibly allow me to determine whether LBA 2 really is bigger and better than LBA. No, to make that determination, I would have to play the entire experience, which of course I did do, and as is always the case, I am ready to talk about that experience. So, let's talk about Little Big Adventure 2. Much like the original, LBA 2 presents the player with an isometric perspective, pseudo-open world, with a number of different locations to be visited and relatively open-ended exploration available within each of those locations. Despite each location being generally larger and more detailed than the first LBA, LBA 2 is not a fully integrated open world, as the game is split up into a number of islands and, interestingly enough, planets, and each of those locations allows players to navigate any number of scenes and screens. While a given segment of a location can be relatively large, each location is itself self-contained, meaning once you move from one area to the next, the state of the prior screen is effectively reset. So, let's say you cleared out a bunch of enemies from screen X, and then you navigate to screen Y. Well, when you go back to screen X, everything has respawned, and any actions you took, short of specific plot-driven events, are reset. Just like the first title in the series, LBA 2's world expands the more you play it, eventually encompassing an entire alien planet that feels very different to the environments that you might have been used to if you're familiar with LBA 1. Certain locations from Little Big Adventure do make a comeback here though, including the infamous Temple of Boo, which has been turned into a tourist attraction with a sort of roller coaster ride going through a good chunk of the temple, which I've got to say, I absolutely loved. I thought it was both comical and interesting how the events of the first game formed the foundations of certain events and locations in the second game, and seeing how different well-known areas of interest evolved in the intervening time between LBA 1 and LBA 2 was a joy to experience, as was seeing how relationships originally formed in LBA 1 had shifted by the start of LBA 2. The heroics of the game's main character, Twinsen, from the first game are well known to pretty much everyone on his home world, and I really enjoyed the continuity that the team built into LBA 2's early hours, as well as the eventual world expansion that resulted the further you progressed into the game. And that world expansion, as well as the general world building prevalent during the early areas of the game, do a great job of setting the stage for the entirety of your adventure, which will be filled with platforming, combat, puzzle solving, and quest-based shenanigans. And we're going to talk about each of those gameplay mechanics throughout our discussion. Suffice it to say, LBA 2 provides a variety of gameplay scenarios for players to progress through, and that variety is something I ultimately ended up really enjoying. Before we get to that though, we need to talk about some of the more basic elements of the game's design, including the way you make your way through the various sections of the game world that you'll eventually explore. Just like LBA 1, maneuvering around the various screens and environments in the game is done exclusively using your keyboard. There are no mouse inputs, and there are no options for controller usage. This is an old-school, keyboard-only kind of experience, despite the fact that it was originally released in 1997, which you might expect would mean LBA 2 would leverage some of the technological amenities prevalent in the computer game industry around this time, like primarily mouse and controller support. When we discussed LBA 1, I made the claim that restricting user input to a keyboard-only control scheme actually worked really well, despite how unnatural it might feel to anyone who is more familiar with the traditional mouse and keyboard kind of setup. Well, the fact is this control scheme works equally well for LBA 2, and in fact might be an even better implementation than LBA 1. There's nothing overtly obvious as to why that is, because on the surface, the controls are pretty much identical. But for some reason, whether because of my own familiarity given my LBA 1 playthrough, or due to some under-the-covers changes that made the game's controls feel snappier, LBA 2's controls, and the feeling of playing the game from one moment to the next, simply feels better than LBA 1 ever did. Actually navigating around the game world is accomplished using tank controls, meaning all movement is based on the orientation of your character, as opposed to being aligned statically with the screen you may be viewing. As an example, if Twinsen, the main character in the game, is facing to the right, pressing up on your arrow key will move you further in that direction, because that's forward from the perspective of the character. This is a decidedly older style of control, and for those who may not be used to it, it does take a little bit of getting used to. If you've played other tank control-based games though, it will not take long to get a feel for moving around the game world. And actually moving around the game world is generally speaking a much smoother affair than in LBA 1. Given LBA 2's move to a fully realized three-dimensional world, the game's navigation has been enhanced to update your in-game view based on a variety of different predefined camera angles, similar in many respects to games like Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil. That said, the game doesn't always give you the angle you would prefer, and occasionally makes you walk quite a ways into the distance before your perspective changes. So it's a good thing you can press the Enter key at any time to force a screen refresh, which depending on which direction you're facing in a given area of the game world, will automatically update your perspective, and most of the time give you a better view of your immediate surroundings. Anyway, once you get used to the movement controls and navigating around the game world, you'll come upon one of the more interesting features in the game, which is the fact that Twinsen has multiple moods, or modes of movement and action, that can be swapped between using your keyboard's function keys, depending on the situation you find yourself in. If you've played LBA 1, these moods are going to be very familiar to you, but for those of you who may not have played the first game, or for individuals who may need a little bit of a refresher, we're going to go through each in some detail. The very first mode is known as Normal, which basically means this is the default way you move around and interact with the game world. In Normal mode, you walk around the game at a moderate speed and can interact with both the environment as well as other characters. This is the only mode that allows you to actually interact with the environment, which can consist of exploring bookshelves, chests, and other objects for items, flipping switches in dungeons, and talking with other characters. All of those interactions are executed using the spacebar, which effectively acts as a global action key for each of the different modes, although each mode does have a different default action that the spacebar will execute. The second mode is known as Sporty Mode, the equivalent of the Athletic mode from the first game, which is the mechanism that allows you to move more quickly throughout the game world. Your default movement speed using Sporty Mode is a brisk run, and the spacebar here allows you to jump. This is the mode you want to use if you want to get someplace quickly, or if you have to work your way through any number of platforming sections encountered throughout the game world. That platforming typically involves jumping across gaps, sometimes over water, which by the way is deadly because you cannot swim in this game, though you may also use the jump ability in sporty mode to vertically explore the environment, as there are certain sections with raised platforms, hills, and other features that you can effectively climb by jumping up them. In LBA 1, athletic mode was an interesting concept marred by the fact that if you happened to run into an obstacle or wall, you would take damage, which let me tell you, really wasn't fun. Luckily, LBA 2 refined this aspect of the game, and sporty mode is now fully usable without needing to worry about stubbing your toe on a random wall and losing some hit points. You might think that this would be a minor improvement, but in fact, it is absolutely huge. I cannot stress enough how much better the game feels being able to use the sporty mode to run around the game world without having to worry about banging into an obstacle and taking damage. This is one of my favorite improvements that LBA 2 made over the original, and it's legitimately a big deal. The third mode in the game is your aggressive mode, which is the mode you want to use if you have to attack enemies, especially if you want to engage in actual fisticuffs, which is only available in this mode. In aggressive mode, you move in a sort of fight stance, which is a bit more cumbersome than sporty or normal mode, and you use your spacebar to execute a series of punches and kicks, with two different modes within aggressive mode itself. There's auto, which picks one of a variety of punches and kicks automatically whenever you press the spacebar, and there's manual mode, which allows you to pick which attack you use depending on which directional arrow you press in combination with the spacebar. I did end up using both modes a little bit throughout my playthrough, but the fact is, the number of enemies that you would actually want to punch or kick remains limited to enemies that aren't armed, just like in LBA 1. So this mode, while still something useful in certain occasions, is a bit more limited than what you might expect. The fourth and final mode in the game is discreet mode, which is effectively stealth mode. When you activate discreet mode, you move around in a tiptoe kind of stance accompanied by a cool string pluck sound effect kind of musical note. Moving in discreet mode reduces the ability for enemies to detect you, and pressing your spacebar here crouches down and reduces enemy visibility even more. These modes introduce a good deal of variety to the game, and generally speaking, actions are locked to an individual mode rather than being global, meaning if you want to jump, you have to pick sporty mode, and if you want to investigate something, you need to use normal mode. The one action that is global is attacking with various weaponry, which includes any number of different weapon-based attacks, like throwing darts, using a blowgun, swinging a sword, and as with LBA 1, tossing your ever-present magical ball and hoping that your aim and the game's physics will work in your favor. Attacking in Little Big Adventure 2 is pretty much unchanged from LBA 1, in that combat is a core component of the experience, and it almost universally doesn't feel good to participate in. There are a number of issues with LBA 2's combat mechanics, with a couple being particularly troublesome. The first is the simple act of aiming your weapons, especially your magical ball, which is a hit or miss and mostly a miss affair. Aiming your magic ball requires trial and error, no matter how proficient you are at the game, because the isometric perspective can sometimes cause issues with your ability to perceive where your ball is going to end up, and whether it actually hits the object or enemy you're attempting to aim at. Most of the time, if you miss once, you're going to miss again, because the precision of adjusting your aim just isn't there. And when you're trying to adjust your aim to hit a constantly moving target, it's a recipe for constant misses, which can become frustrating. Luckily, there are other weapons like the blowgun that are much easier to use, but ultimately deal less damage per attack. This, for me, is a trade-off I was willing to make, because the blowgun can allow you to stun-lock enemies in place, the same way any range-based enemies will often do to you. And let me tell you, stun-locking those bastards feels really good, especially after all of the trouble ranged combatants gave me in the first game. The issue with that, however, is that as you progress later in the game, some enemies will become impervious to your less damaging attacks, forcing you to use certain weapons, like the magic ball, that may not be your personal favorite. Luckily, there is a pretty large variety of weapons at your disposal, including those mounted to different vehicles, but short of some super overpowered weapons like the laser guns attached to a spacesuit, most of the time, combat in LBA 2 is not the best part of the overall experience, because enemies in LBA 2 are just as deadly as those in the first title, and occasionally, even if you get the drop on an enemy, you're going to need some luck to come out on top, because if you get attacked just once by a range-based enemy, you can almost guarantee they will attack you again before you can react, at which point you'll either have to get really lucky to survive, or you'll end up dying and losing a life, represented in LBA 2 by the number of clover slots and clovers you have in your possession. And speaking of dying, you're going to want to avoid that whenever you can. And the best way to do that is to, whenever possible, avoid fighting enemies, because like we've been talking about, the combat in LBA 2 can be brutal, especially late in the game, which turns into a combat gauntlet that I've got to say I did not particularly enjoy. You do have a life bar and a magic meter, which impacts how far you can throw your magic ball and is also upgradable as you progress through the story. And there are various items in the game world that can help replenish your life and magic, including a magical horn that can store some additional hit points to both heal yourself and allies. And, like I mentioned, you do gather additional lives in the form of clovers and clover boxes that you'll find throughout your adventure. Even with those assists, however, combat in LBA 2 is never something that I would consider to be a smooth experience. As you might imagine, the difficulty of the combat pretty much guarantees that at some point you're going to lose all your lives and die. The good news is that the game does have an autosave system in place, and luckily, the autosave is in fact pretty effective at keeping current progress, which appears to happen at every screen transition. Even better, however, is the fact that you can now save the game whenever you want, allowing you to reload your progress and start exactly where you left off, in whatever condition you might have been in. This is obviously a feature prevalent in a lot of games. Only, it was not available in LBA 1, because in that title, you could only rely on the game's own autosaves to maintain your progress, which, while mostly effective, could sometimes result in some lost progress. Being able to save anywhere and anytime you want is a huge improvement for LBA 2, and goes a long way to removing tedium, frustration, and irritation caused by some other aspects of the game, like the sometimes brutally challenging combat. Despite having the same level of combat and platforming difficulty as LBA 1, I never really felt frustrated with LBA 2, and I believe one of the main reasons LBA 2 felt so much better to play than the original game in the series was the inclusion of a manual save system that allowed you to make incremental progress if you so wanted, without losing any appreciable gains you may have made. This was another significant improvement to the game, and one that sounds like a simple thing, but is instead truly profound in how much better it makes LBA 2 feel to play than its predecessor. That being said, LBA 2 can still feel really janky to maneuver around, and nowhere is that more noticeable than when attempting to complete various platforming-centric challenges in the game world. Simply jumping from one spot to another can occasionally be a death-inducing event, which, similar to aiming while in combat, can be much trickier than what it has any right being. For what it's worth, I actually didn't think the platforming was horrible in LBA 2, but I think the reason I was more forgiving of this game's platforming is simply because I could save my progress right before any platforming section that I knew had a high likelihood of failure. Once again, being able to save anytime you want is a big deal with LBA 2. Anyway, beyond the more direct action-oriented platforming and combat gameplay, there's also a fair amount of point-and-click styled adventuring, complete with a full-fledged item and inventory system, albeit in a 3D world, and without the ability to actually point or click on anything since you can't use a mouse with LBA 2. The quests and puzzles you'll undertake while playing LBA 2 are all pretty darn good, for the most part, and in fact, the early part of the game before combat becomes so prevalent was probably my favorite part of the whole experience. Wandering around different sections of land, not knowing where to go, but knowing I might discover something super useful anywhere I walked, felt incredibly engaging, and I loved how the adventure-oriented portion of the game felt to play. That said, the quests in LBA 2 can sometimes devolve into a series of back-and-forth fetches between a couple of different areas, where it feels like the game's designers added in this somewhat unnecessary back-and-forth exploration simply to pad out the game a little bit. It wasn't horrible, but it was noticeable, and was one aspect of the game that I thought could have been streamlined to make for an even better overall experience. Despite the lack of streamlining, though, and despite the difficulty and imprecision of both the combat and platforming, and despite some janky gameplay here and there, the simple fact is that LBA 2 is, like its predecessor, a charming and engaging game whose qualities outweigh its deficiencies. And even beyond that, I believe LBA 2 is a dramatically better overall package than LBA 1, especially when you include several of the quality of life improvements that the team implemented for LBA 2. If you liked LBA 1, I've got to believe you'll likely love LBA 2. If you didn't like LBA 1, I believe LBA 2 has just enough improvements that you may in fact like LBA 2. Your personal mileage may vary, but I know that from my perspective, LBA 2 is a much better game than LBA 1, and is an experience that kept my attention and my heart pretty much from beginning to end. We're going to talk more about why I believe LBA 2 is an experience that you should play in just a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos to watch. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Little Big Adventure 2 for the MS-DOS computer platform, the back of the box says, "He'll go to the ends of the earth for you." Twinsen is back. In the sequel to one of the most critically acclaimed adventure games ever, Twinsen and his friends are witness to the arrival of the Esmers, strange visitors from the distant planet Zelich. Why are they on your home world? What do they want? All the answers are revealed as you guide Twinsen on a magical adventure through a fantastical 3D world beyond your wildest dreams and emotions. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box with some captions. One of them, with a screenshot of pretty much many of the characters you'll encounter, says, "Over 300 real-time animated 3D characters with texture-mapped polygons and lighting effects in 256 colors." Another caption says, "Talk, explore, fight, drive, fly, and let your imagination run wild." Another caption says, "Interiors in pre-rendered isometric 3D. Exterior in true perspective texture-mapped 3D with multiple camera views. And finally, explore over 220 locations on 3 planets." So that is the back of the box for Little Big Adventure 2, and I've got to say, this one sells me on the game. The graphics look charming. They definitely look like a later 90s isometric style computer game. And I've got to say, it definitely trips my nostalgia. I really think this looks great. The back of the box looks really good. I think there's just enough included here to make you interested in wanting to play the game. The graphics do look kind of zany a little bit, and certainly the character design is not what I would consider, looking like humanity. I mean, there's some resemblance there, but the characters are very exaggerated in their overall designs. And I've got to say, just the overall box, it sells me. It sells me on the game. Even if I had not played the original Little Big Adventure, I think this box would have sold me on the experience because it just looks really interesting and is something I definitely would have picked up if I saw it sitting on a store shelf. Back when this came out, I don't remember ever seeing this on a store shelf, but if I did, I've got to say the back of the box, it definitely sells me on the experience. Anyway, we're going to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game now, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. I've got to say, the overall environments included in the game are really nicely detailed, especially for the time in which the game was released. The environments are very diverse. The overall areas that you'll explore are expansive, much larger than what we saw in LBA 1. Everything from an environmental perspective here is much more advanced than LBA 1. And even beyond that, just simply look good. The graphics here look great from an environmental perspective. Characters, like I was just mentioning when we were talking about the back of the box, they're kind of a mixed bag. And they show very clearly that this is still an early 3D title. While the environments were greatly upgraded for LBA 2 over LBA 1, the character graphics feel mostly untouched, which is a bit of a shame. It's not a detriment to the game overall, but it is something I would have hoped would have gotten an extra coat of paint, just like the rest of the graphics in the game. What I will say though is that the 3D isometric perspective here works pretty well for the game overall, but can sometimes cause perception issues when aiming at enemies and navigating certain platforming areas. Definitely still not a perfect experience, but not a bad one either. The game also includes a bunch of pre-rendered cutscenes which are all very well done for the era of gaming that they were created in. Today, they'd really be nothing to write home about, but it's very easy to see that they were a labor of love when the game was originally created, and remain charming and endearing even today. Overall, the game's visuals look pretty darn good, and even look better than LBA 1's already charming graphics. From a technical perspective, LBA 2 looks better than the first game in nearly every way while retaining all of the original title's charm. Definitely a job well done by the game's art team. Moving on to the sound and music, the auditory environment in LBA 2 is absolutely stellar, with music that enhances the feeling of playing the game through a mix of tracks that convey wonder and awe, sound effects that match the action on the screen perfectly, and voiceovers that are, well, they're there, but honestly not too bad. The music in LBA 2 is definitely a highlight for me, as it was in the first game. It turns out LBA's music in general is almost magical. And I honestly believe one of the reasons I enjoyed the game as much as I did is because of how good the game sounds. I don't know that I would call LBA 2 an improvement over the first game because they sound pretty darn close to one another, but it doesn't really matter. LBA 2's music is outstanding. I truly love it. My only small critique about the music is that for certain areas of the game world, it almost feels like the music is randomly chosen, not tailored to perfectly fit the scene that you're exploring. This most often happens in overworld areas of the game, but can occasionally occur indoors as well, which can be a bit confusing when it happens. Now, the good news is that LBA 2's music is so good that it almost doesn't matter what track is playing at any point in time, but I would have personally preferred tracks just a bit more tailored to the action on the screen, or the environment that you're exploring. Sound effects, by contrast, all align perfectly with whatever scene you're experiencing, and while there's nothing to call attention to as being particularly memorable from a sound effect perspective, they're still very well done and serve to enhance the feeling of playing the game. Beyond the music and sound effects, if I were going to provide any additional critique of the auditory environment in the game, it would have to be levied against the voice acting, which, while better than LBA 1, still isn't what I would call professional grade. Twinsen's voice actor in particular is dramatically improved over LBA 1, and other characters all sound way better than they used to. But at the end of the day, LBA 2 is not going to win any awards based on its voice acting alone. It's there, and it works, but I wouldn't call it particularly noteworthy. Overall though, LBA 2's audio is as good as LBA 1, and in some cases even better. Despite a couple of minor critiques, I really don't have many complaints here. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Little Big Adventure 2, you once again play as Twinsen, the hero of the first game, who appears to be enjoying a well-deserved, slower-paced lifestyle after having saved the home world that he lives on from the evil Dr. Funfrock. Rather than continuing to go on world-spanning adventures, Twinsen is effectively retired, with a wife who loves him and a child on the way in the near future. Twinsen has settled into normal life, despite everyone knowing who he is and how much of a hero he can be, and he is, by all accounts, happy. One day, following a particularly nasty rainstorm, Twinsen and other local residents notice an alien spaceship has landed at a nearby settlement. These aliens, a race of beings known as the Esmers, declare themselves to be friends to the locals, a species of alien that only wants to learn about others and make friends in the process. This all sounds well and good on the surface, though many of the residents feel like something is just a little bit off, primarily because, for some reason, all of their wizards begin going missing shortly after the Esmer's arrival. As you might imagine, something foul is afoot, and it's going to be up to you to go on a world-spanning adventure to hopefully save the day once again. Will Twinsen be successful in stopping an alien menace from doing a variety of dastardly deeds? There's only one way to find out. This is an example of a story that I believe works really well for the game that it was created for, with a constantly evolving plot that has a couple of twists and turns to keep players guessing, while mixing perfectly with the title's underlying gameplay that provides a suitable level of challenge for gamers of all ages to enjoy. LBA 2's story feels a bit more grounded than the narrative in LBA 1, despite the fact that you will literally be flying in outer space at various points throughout the story. But regardless, I believe LBA 2's story is vastly improved over the original title, and while there was nothing inherently bad about Little Big Adventure's story, LBA 2's narrative is simply better in every capacity, and I am very glad I had the chance to experience it firsthand. I especially enjoyed how your goals change as the story plays out, because this is not an example of knowing exactly where the story is going to go right from the beginning of your playthrough, and I truly appreciated how fresh it made the whole experience feel. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've already talked a good deal about the general structure of the game and the majority of the controls you'll experience, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to reiterate, though, is that despite the inherent similarity of the controls and general game structure between LBA 1 and LBA 2, the simple fact is that LBA 2 does everything better than the first game, and after playing the sequel with all of its enhancements and quality of life improvements, I believe going back to play LBA 1 would be like dousing yourself with a bucket of cold water. All of the changes LBA 2 made might sound like they'd be little things, but trust me, if you've played LBA 1 and then you play LBA 2, you will very clearly feel how much better those changes make the game. And when you combine those improvements with a quality story, nicely detailed, if still early 3D era graphics, and a magical soundtrack, you have a recipe for a winner. And LBA 2, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is definitely a winner in my book. So what is our verdict on Little Big Adventure 2? Well, let me start out by saying that Little Big Adventure 2 pleasantly surprised me. When I first sat down to begin playing the game, I honestly believed I was just going to get more Little Big Adventure, which for me was going to be just fine, because I actually wanted to experience that kind of game again. I know I had a fair number of critiques about the first title in the series, but at the end of the day, I truly did believe that the whole was greater than the sum of its parts, and I was looking for more of that same kind of experience. What I ended up getting, though, was a game that was dramatically better than its predecessor in nearly every conceivable way, and despite the fact that there were still some design decisions and gameplay mechanics that could drive frustration, namely the combat and the platforming, all of the little niceties built into LBA 2 were able to offset any of those frustrations, and even beyond, made me legitimately love this game. If you played LBA 1 and thought, if only the dev team could have made some tweaks, this would have been amazing, then you should definitely play LBA 2, because that's exactly what happened with this game. Little Big Adventure 2 is a huge leap over the original title, and stands on its own as a worthwhile, engaging, and downright fun experience, which is why I have no reservations inducting Little Big Adventure 2 into our pantheon of classic gaming. Now, just to be clear, if you're the kind of person who hated LBA 1, you might want to be a bit more cautious, because there are a number of design decisions from the first game that remain front and center in the sequel. But for everyone else, LBA 2 is a must-play experience, especially if you enjoyed LBA 1 and thought to yourself, I want some more of that, but better. That's exactly what LBA 2 is. It's Little Big Adventure, but better. And it is therefore absolutely deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. Or is it? Here's the thing with anybody having an opinion. It is their opinion. So, in my opinion, Little Big Adventure 2 is absolutely deserving of a spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. That doesn't mean that everybody is going to feel the same way, and earlier I mentioned that I was going to challenge ISO to play Little Big Adventure 2 to see what he thought of the experience, because he did not like Little Big Adventure 1. At the time, I mentioned that I probably didn't have enough time to get that in for this episode, but lo and behold, it happened. ISO did play Little Big Adventure 2. He did record his own review of the game. And luckily, I have that on hand for everybody to listen to right now. So ISO, my friend, and resident CGT Little Big Adventure superfan, take it away.
G'day everyone, it's ISO here, the Challenge Master. Tony, don't think that you can just lay a challenge down without a response. I'm here to tell you all that I've played Little Big Adventure 2, much to the disappointment of myself. So we're going to do a little counterpoint. I'm pretty sure Tony felt a bit guilty about his verdict because the doctor is giving a second opinion. And he also wanted another 3-hour podcast. So we're looking forward to this. Please join me as I give you a second opinion. Now, off the bat, I'm not going to repeat the history that Tony's done because we all know that he does a very good job and I'd only butcher it. So the history that I'm going to provide is going to be a personal one. Most of you on Discord will know this story, but pretty much LBA is the running joke in the Discord. It's become the butt of every joke due to the fact that I hate it so much. We pretty much introduce any new member to the fact that you need to know that Tony loves FMV games, that I hate Little Big Adventure, and that I have a lot of high school nicknames. For example, Little Big Adventure was my nickname in high school for many years. So this hatred started from the weekend gaming challenges that Tony used to set. So I'm pretty sure Rich Senewald, the famous sponsor here at Classic Gaming Today, he had sponsored Little Big Adventure and Tony had been playing it. So he set a number of challenges for the isometric week. Little did I know that it would be one of the biggest nightmares that I'd ever have to endure because we had time restraints back in the day. It would be pretty much you'd get the challenges on a Friday and you'd have to submit them on a Sunday. So I was trying frantically to get to the Temple of Boo to get my points. The Temple of Boo, for anybody that hasn't played it in the first Little Big Adventure, is a complete shambles of game design. It's just the worst platforming in the worst ways. It just drove me to frustration. I think probably the time restriction didn't help, but it was also that the game was god-awful. And I complained to no end, and I got stuck with, well, we got stuck with the joke that is LBA sucks. So that's pretty much the history of how that started. And I have actually played a little bit of Little Big Adventure 2 previously, because it became another weekend gaming challenge later on, which was probably just to rub salt into the wound for me. I did enjoy it a little bit more than Little Big Adventure 1 because it wasn't quite as awful in terms of the way it played, and the challenge wasn't quite as in-depth. But I didn't play any further than what I had to, so I probably got about 2 or 3 hours into it. But yeah, that's how we started with this. So I was coming into this with a clean slate. I really wanted to give this a fair chance. I didn't want to poo-poo all over it just for the sake of a joke. So I came in with an optimistic mind to see if I could do what Tony had done and reevaluate whether the Little Big Adventure 2 is worth your time today. I'll start with saying that Little Big Adventure 2 is very similar to Little Big Adventure 1. The general bones of this game are pretty much the same. The major changes are just tweaks. So what has changed is that the general gameplay has been improved dramatically. They've taken many of the complaints from LBA 1 and rectified them in terms of when you would run in LBA 1 and hit a wall or something, you'd take damage. One of the silliest things I've ever heard of, which Tony did criticize in LBA 1, and yeah, they have fixed it in this one. So that's one score to LBA 2 right off the bat. The rest of the sort of controls are very similar. You've still got the 4 modes which Twinsen can use, which are normal, sporty, aggressive, and discreet. So I might just go through those 4 modes and my personal experience with those 4 modes. So normal in this game has sort of become the back seat and is really, in my opinion, a bit of a waste of time. So the main action use button has been carried over to the other 4 modes, so you don't really need to go into normal mode unless you're sort of RPing, so it just puts Twinsen in a normal walk state rather than a run mode, so it's a lot slower. You get that sort of RP mode, but it's really a complete waste of time because you want to get somewhere, you need to switch the modes, and the switching of the modes, while better than it was in LBA 1, it's still quite clunky. So normal I found myself almost never using, except when I'd sort of forgotten that you needed to you didn't need to swap back to normal mode to just interact with people, which you did in LBA 1. So yeah, normal was a sort of a little bit of a no-go. Sporty is your bread and butter. You're going to be running around a lot more around the world with Sporty. That's the one that that's the mode where you can jump as well. So most of your platforming, this is the platforming mode. Which is probably one of the worst suits of LBA. It's a really, really bad platforming game, which we'll talk about a bit later. And aggressive mode is your combat stance, which is probably just as bad, if not worse, in terms of the gameplay. It really, the combat in this game is sloppy, it's frustrating. The general hand-to-hand combat is just hard to really gauge because of the tank controls, which Tony would have mentioned in his review. It's sort of hard to sort of get that first hit in. Most of what you want to do is a stun lock with all your enemies, and if you miss that first one, you're opening yourself up to a stun lock. That's one thing that this game has done better than LBA 1 is LBA 1 would you get stun locked into oblivion. It would just like you get hit and then you just would not be able to get out of this constant barrage of enemy attacks. This game has still got it, but it's way less egregious. But you've got the hand-to-hand combat, and then you've also got the range combat. So the range combat is you've got the magic ball, which returns, for better or worse. The trajectory of the magic ball is very hard to predict. You've got almost no way of knowing where your first shot's going to go. So by the time you can course correct, you're either locked in a stun lock, or most battles, sort of the way that I could describe it is it's pretty much you've got a stormtrooper battle where two people are trying to fire shots at each other, and you're just watching this disaster play out on screen. And it's incredibly frustrating, especially if you've got multiple enemies on the screen, because it's just the amount of damage a lot of these enemies take is just ludicrous as well. So, the combat is god awful. It does present you with a lot of different weapons throughout the game where you can, and it gets better towards the end in terms of what you can, the damage you can output, but by that stage you've already done so much combat and you've got quite a few gauntlets of battles to go through, and by that stage you're just really sort of over the combat. So that was my major complaint with the combat, is the stun locking and the just getting it to sort of hit into place. We'll move on to discrete mode. Again, sort of a little bit of it's interesting that this game sort of presents you with multiple options in the way that you can present tackle scenarios. I found that discrete was probably the least effective, just because it was sort of slow, and again, the unpredictability of the way enemies react made it really difficult to sort of justify using it. I found most of the time you'd end up getting seen anyway, and it would just devolve into a massive fight. That's probably not everybody's experience, but it just seemed to be with me. Every time I tried to sneak around, it would just devolve into a massive fist fight. So discrete did work for a number of scenarios, which the game sort of telegraphs quite clearly that you need to use it. The other thing discrete mode does is it actually changes the way that the magic ball is thrown. It does it more as a lob, sort of an overhead, so it can change the angle. For a lot of the crappy puzzles which involve throwing a ball at an object off screen, which is another awful design decision, but regardless, that's what they've decided to do. So yeah, I found discrete was fairly useless. Plus, the sound that it makes is so annoying. It's like a dun 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 dun, and you're tippy-toeing around. It's not my cup of tea. So as you continue to play through these 4 different modes, you'll notice that they've all got their own little flavor, I guess is the best way to put it. The way that the animations will play will be slightly different between modes. So like the wind up for a magic ball shot is obviously quicker in sporty than it is in discrete, and it's interesting in the sense that it adds some variety to the gameplay, but often more often than not, it just ends up throwing you off whatever thing you're trying to do. It just makes it so you're not effectively doing what you want to do, which frustrated me more than it intrigued me. So yeah, that's the 4 modes of combat and traversal. The general movement and controls in this game, I find that while improved from LBA1, are still really clunky and sticky in a way that for a platformer and a combat game, it just doesn't lend itself well the way that these controls are sort of set up. I will make the note here that I played the classic version off of Steam, which I believe the major change is that the camera angles are slightly different. It's sort of in the open world sections. Well, the when you're not inside a building, it sort of makes the camera sort of float behind Twinsen rather than do the isometric views like a Resident Evil 1 sort of, or Alone in the Dark, where you've got like the fixed camera angles and you're running in and out of fixed points, which I actually didn't mind. I thought that was an improvement. I did sort of see the comparison, and I think I probably would have disliked it more, as to Tony's complaint on his side of the review. The distance looked like you're getting too far away from the action. Although I didn't play this, so I can't really put my 2 cents in. But yeah, the classic version seemed to fix a little bit of that camera action. You'll find Twinsen catching on edges and not quite going exactly where you want to go. I also had a lot of experience with different moving platforms glitching out. I'm not sure if Tony had this same sort of issue, but I noticed that a lot of the trains and trams and stuff like that, if you were doing some platforming and maybe moving in and out of menus, if you restore a save, the platforms would just go completely bonkers, and you'd have to sort of either restore or leave the area and come back, where the world would reset. You never lose much time, but it's enough that it frustrates the hell out of you. Twinsen will also find the various vehicles throughout the adventure, namely a car. These are a fun distraction. They're never really anything that you get too excited about, but they sort of break up the gameplay a little bit. And these control, as well as Twinsen does, the environments in the open world, in air quotation marks open world, are interesting. Like, it sort of adds a little bit more dynamics to the world. Like, you sort of get a bigger picture, and then as you go into the cityscapes, it's not like a GTA style open world, but it's enough that it sort of makes the world feel lived in, I guess. Another major difference between LBA 1 and LBA 2 is the fact that you can save anywhere. As Tony sort of alluded to in his review, this is a massive improvement. The autosave feature in 1 was ludicrous in the way that you were always unsure of where your progress had been saved. So if you went to restore, you weren't sure if you were going to lose a chunk of time. If you were having issues in certain sections, i.e. the Temple of Boo, you weren't sure whether you'd made a rod for your own back, or whether you'd sort of have to try and backtrack back to a point where you could get a little bit more in terms of life, or like a foothold for your platforming section that was coming up. That was a major complaint I had with LBA 1, but LBA 2 you can save anywhere, which makes the life system almost trivial, because if you're suspecting that you're getting a massive fight, or if you've got a terrible platforming section, you can just save scum your way out of it. I would highly recommend in most games that you don't do that, but this game is so incredibly frustrating that it's almost a necessity that you need to save scum in order to do most of the platforming and combat sections. The fact that almost every surface that isn't the surface that you need to land on is a one-hit kill it just really makes the pace of the game come to a complete crawl when you get to these sections. It's a major complaint I have with LBA 2. It just feels like you're tricking the game, you're not playing the game. And as the game goes on, you start to notice that it's a bad loop where you'll have like maybe a 5-minute section where you can play freely, and then you have these sections that are like really intense in terms of the platforming or the combat, and then you're loading through menus. I literally had probably 100 saves by the end of my playthrough, most of which were just to jump between rocks on a lava field, or jump between rocks to another character that you needed to sort of go backwards and forwards. That sort of opens up another issue I had with the game, is that, like, there's so much backtracking. Like, the first section of the game will require you to go to this island, and then you go back to where you were to give another character an item, and then the character will be like, oh yeah, I actually forgot to tell you that you need to grab this as well. So you're literally going back to the same place. This would maybe be forgivable once. This happens at least 2 or 3 times, and it's really frustrating just doing this backtracking backwards and forwards. It's, frustrating. It's the word that I keep coming back to. I'll come up with another word by the end of it, and we'll share it together. But yeah, frustrating. Now that we've got some of the general gameplay out of the way, let's move on to the story. Little Big Adventure 2 pretty much takes off after the events of the first one. Not that I'd know, because I gave up after the Temple of Vu, but I'm assuming he saves the world, and soon thereafter knocks up his girlfriend. The start of the game is pretty much a massive storm has hit the island where Twinsen has retired to with his partner. And you are tasked with saving Dino Fly, your buddy who has become ill from the storm. To say that the story in this game is unappealing is probably giving it a little bit too much credit. I know I'm probably not the target demographic for this sort of story, but it continues on a ludicrous path, which is really hard to sort of forgive. The next major plot point is aliens out of nowhere land, and you're expected to believe that they are friendly. It's quite clear that they're not friendly, and this sort of story just sort of goes on, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. Sort of, it's a bit of a pain in the ass in the end, but I did find myself starting to get into it by about the 3/4 mark, only for it to fall apart at the end. No spoilers, obviously, but yeah, the plot really sort of picks up once the main event starts to happen, but the start's a little bit slow, and then it sort of jumps really quickly to the middle. It escalates very quickly, and then it sort of stops again very quickly. So it drags out in the middle. I found the pacing a little bit off, but yeah, the ludicrous nature of this whimsical, sort of cartoony child story didn't do a lot for me. I can understand that a lot of people probably do like it, but for me, I just found the characters grating and annoying. Zoe, the girlfriend, does nothing but nag you, and then goes missing for a massive portion of the story with absolutely no explanation. Your best mate is forgetful and unuseful 95% of the time until he comes and saves the day, when he is useful as a plot point. Most of the other characters, the voice acting in this game is borderline psychotic. It's all over the place. You've got super dry deadpan delivery, followed by the most ludicrous zany voice. It's really 1 to 11 all the time. I know Tony had a lot of complaints about the voice acting in Final Fantasy X, but this is by far worse in terms of the actual character portrayals. The actual quality of the recording is quite good. There's not a lot to complain about there. All the audio actually sounds quite crisp. There's a couple that are a little bit less quality, but most of them are pretty consistently good. It's just the actual deliveries of the lines are pretty bonkers. But I guess they're going for a childish sort of aesthetic, but it really does feel like a child's pantomime or something that's going on most of the time. As we're already talking about sound, I guess you guys can tell I'm not as professional as Tony, but we'll keep going. The music is actually pretty good. I quite enjoyed a lot of it. It's sort of very reminiscent of LBA1, and it wouldn't surprise me entirely if it was pretty much lifted with a couple of extra new tracks. A notable track is Emerald Moon. I quite like that one. Sort of a cool, somber sort of tone, and obviously the LBA main theme is sort of etched into my brain now due to having listened to it a number of times due to Tony's requests. But it is what it is. It is a good song. I think the music is let down more by the fact that you'll hear the same tracks quite frequently. And I agree with Tony that sometimes the track choices for the different sections, I'm not sure if they're randomized or if it's if it was just bad placement, but sometimes they don't fit the mood or the sort of energy of the story. The sound effects are awful, really bad. That was probably one of the lowlights of the entire game for me, are the sound effects, which is sort of probably not something that you'd expect to be such a thing that somebody would harp on, but I really dislike the sound effects. You've got the wibble wobble of the magic ball. You just hear it so often, and it's just like boing, boing, boing. Again, the discrete mode, the tiptoeing sound, it's annoying. It makes you not want to sort of be in the mode. I found the aggressive mode was even worse. It sounds like a toddler trying to like force out a poo. It's like, and he does that not even when he's attacking. He does that like just walking around, and then the animation is like equally like him walking around with the massive pile of poo in his pants. It's just ludicrous. And just all the little sounds and effects, like you'll hear the same sort of laser effects and sounds, and I think again, frustrating. It's frustrating. We'll move on to the graphics. I can't stand these graphics. It is a product of the time. This is early 3D, 1997. I mean, if you look around the same sort of time, like subjectively, this is not bad, but it's just the way that the aesthetics are put together. I really find it jarring. Like the character models don't sort of seem to work with the 3D environments that they've made. It's sort of one's got a little bit more attention than the other. The character models are sometimes you just can't really understand what they're supposed to be. Like sometimes you think something's a turret, but it's actually like a badger, or like is it supposed to be a bear, or is it supposed to be a duck? The characters are sort of very early 3D, so it's hard to sort of pin that against it as a major point of complaint due to the infancy of the medium that they're using. But still, it's not something that really appeals to me. And an issue I had was a lot of the time the textures weren't, like, you weren't 100% sure whether the ground that you're walking on was either safe or deadly. I had a few instances where I walked on something thinking it was just a flat plane, but it was water, and then you'd insta die. And again, like the sort of the textures of the mountains, sometimes you could walk on them, sometimes you'd slip off and then slip off to your death into a lake of lava or something like that. It wasn't 100% telegraphed whether you could walk on certain areas. it for what it is, I guess it's not too bad. But yeah, I just didn't really get a good vibe from it. The FMV is ho-hum, like most of Twinsen's animations they just look silly. I'm guessing it's going for like that Sunday morning cartoon vibe, but yeah, it did nothing for me. Now for the overall feel. If I haven't made it abundantly clear by now, the overall feel of this game is sticky, uncoordinated, and messy. And I refuse to use the word frustrating. But yeah, it's really an unusual mix of how this sort of comes together. Like, they're obviously ambitious with what they wanted to do with this multiple 4 modes. It didn't work in the first one, and it still sort of struggles to work. Almost less so in this one. I feel like they sort of pared it back more to sort of get around the issues that they were having, but it just doesn't work. The platforming I'll sort of go into in a bit more detail. It's often a very small window of opportunity that they're making you hit with very unprecise platforming controls. Like, it's often a moving platform that you have to sort of land on and then make an immediate sort of twitchy jump afterwards, and it often just ends in a mess. As I sort of alluded to before, the fact that you need to save scum in order to make a lot of the platforming and combat encounters work should say a lot about the gameplay. It just doesn't work. There's only so many times you can watch your character get beaten into a pulp or fall off a bloody ledge, or it boggles my mind how anybody thought that this was fun. Like, a lot of the game element of this game is just non-existent. It's connective tissue to the story elements, which I found sort of lackluster. So the actual gameplay elements is really lacking. Again, with the combat, like the fact that it's just stormtroopers fighting, like you spend like some combat encounters can be almost 1 or 2 minutes where you're just holding the button down. Once you've got the right trajectory, you're just holding the button down. So it's not even engaging once you get it right. The 95% of the time you feel like you've done something right, it's because you've done something accidentally. Like, you've done some cool move by accident because you've just sort of fumbled the controller or the controls in a way that sort of has done what you wanted to do, but it is almost 100% by accident. Every time that I'd done something impressive, it was almost 100% by accident. The ludicrous story and the amount of backtracking that's required throughout the story it annoyed me to the point where my blood began to boil. I haven't had a game frustrate me so quickly in such a short amount of time, even when I knew what I was walking into. I knew I was going to get frustrated, but this game frustrated me within like 20 minutes of playing. I reckon I sent Tony about 900 messages saying how much this game annoyed the shit out of me. It's a testament to the team that a game so mild and aimed at a younger demographic has made me want to punch holes in walls and throw my monitor across the room. That it started to make me question a lot of things, because the amount of people on various forums that absolutely love this game, I'm starting to think that I'm the issue, that maybe it's just me and this game is a pantheon, but it can't be. I just can't work it out for the life of me. Like, every element of this game rubs me up the wrong way. It's like there's even a bloody maze in this game with an invisible floor. Tony hates mazes. An invisible floor maze, and it still gets a pantheon. I just cannot, for the life of me, work it out. Am I going insane? Is it me? Me? The insane one? Don't even get me started. Like, Twinsen is the name of the character, right? But the world that he lives in is Twinsun. Who in their right mind thought this was a good idea? I was so confused for 95% of the dialogue because Twinsen and Twinsen are said in the same sentence like 900 times. How the fuck is anybody supposed to fucking follow this plot? And the fucking ball. You're throwing a ball around the place and it's bouncing everywhere. I just don't understand. Or rather, can someone explain to me how this is Pantheon? I just don't understand. Why is the Temple Boo a fucking amusement park? Twinsen spends most of his time going into ladies' change rooms and ignoring his pregnant wife. It's okay. I think I've come back to my senses. So, what is the overall verdict on this game? Well, it might surprise you to hear this, but this is a complete piece of shit. A footnote. Worse than a fucking footnote. I don't even think I could recommend this lower. This is worse than, what was the worst game we've got? I've played E.T. and it's fucking worse than that. I just can't tell you not to play this more. I'm sorry, I really respect Tony's opinions on pretty much everything. And I think anybody on the Discord will know how much I love this podcast. But do not play this piece of shit. I would prefer to take my dick and slam it in a drawer, which I would also not recommend doing. That was my review of Little Big Piece of Shit 2. I hope you enjoyed my second opinion. As always, I'm very grateful to be a part of this podcast. As much as I am joking around, this is a shining example of how everybody needs to make their own opinions. So please go out and play this and let Tony know that it's a giant piece of shit as well. Thanks.
It is now time to talk about this week's set of gaming challenges, and they are, of course, all focused on Little Big Adventure 2. Your first challenge is to simply stop the rain. When you start the game will be raining. It'll be a pretty bad rainstorm. If you can stop that storm, you will earn 1 coin. Your second challenge is to take a ride in a car. Relatively early in the game, you'll be able to ride in a car around certain environments. If you can take a ride in that car, you will earn 2 coins. And finally, your third challenge is to escape from a dangerous crash landing. Interestingly, there are a number of crash landings that happen in Little Big Adventure 2. If you can escape from the very first crash landing that you experience, you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it.
Now for ISO's challenges for Little Big Adventure 2. Your first challenge, if you choose to accept it, is to get back to the Temple of Boo. Electric Boogaloo. That is worth 1 coin. Your second challenge is to imprison Twinsen. This man needs to be imprisoned, and should have been imprisoned for the entirety of the first game and the second game. So if you can get Twinsen to be incarcerated, you'll receive 2 coins. Your third and final challenge is to uninstall Little Big Adventure 2. If you can take a screenshot of you successfully uninstalling Little Big Adventure 2, you will receive 3 coins. Good luck. You'll sincerely need it.
That was our episode on Little Big Adventure 2. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it, and more than ISO enjoyed playing it. And thank you, ISO, by the way, for sending in your review. It's always great to hear alternate perspectives, and I always appreciate your contributions to the podcast. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Stunt Island. So definitely write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience, and get your comments featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Stunt Island. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.